Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Davis. I'm the Executive Director for the Review Committee for Radiology. And to my right is Dr. Jim Anderson, the Chair of the Review Committee from Oregon State Health Science Center University. And down in front we have with us Ms. Kate Hatlack, Associate Executive Director, also staff of the Review Committee. So I was waiting for the room to fill in. It's interesting how many empty seats there are. Either we were incredibly clear the last time we presented this, or they're at the beach. Okay. We have no financial conflicts of interest to report. Topics for today, we're going to do a quick summary of the composition of the Review Committee, our most recent accreditation decisions over this academic year, our NAS observations in developing those accreditation decisions, some recent discussions with the Review Committee, and of course our updates with IR and ESIR. Currently, the Review Committee is composed of 12 voting members. We have 4 nominating organizations, the most recent being the AOA. This is the current roster of RRC members, headed again by Dr. Jim Anderson, and Vice Chair is Dr. Susan John, a pediatric radiologist out of the University of Texas at Houston. From this list, as of June 30th, we will say goodbye to Dr. Dwayne Mesua from William Beaumont and Dr. Gautam Reddy from University of Washington, as they have completed their 6-year term with the committee. And our resident member, Carl Soderland, who I don't know if he's here today, he will also be departing us as of June 30th this year. This is a geographic distribution to represent where our members hail from. I must say, of many of the committees that I've worked with, this is probably the most equally distributed that I've seen. And of course, when we say goodbye, we also say hello to our new members. Our newest members will be Dr. Vicki Marks will join us as of July 1, 2017, coming to us from the University of Southern California. And our new resident member is Dr. Krishna Patel, coming to us from Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, where she's currently an R3. Scheduled meeting dates. Topic of great interest. We received several inquiries in the office via email and phone call in terms of whether the Review Committee will meet again this year. We've already met twice in January and April, and we have decided that we will host a 3rd meeting late summer, early fall in September. Again, the Review Committee being flexible to handle the load in terms of the IR applications and ESIR applications to continue to keep those cranking and moving through the approval process. This is the Review Committee staff. I've already mentioned myself and Kate Hatlack. Individuals you don't see that are back in the office are Ms. Sarah Thomas, our Senior Accreditation Administrator, and the newest member of our team is Ms. Brenda Trevino, who's also joined us as an Associate Executive Director. So let's talk about some of the actions that the Review Committee has taken this academic year in evaluating the programs. So here are some of the current stats in terms of their diagnostic radiology and all of the fellowship programs in terms of the number of programs and the trainees on duty. Diagnostic radiology is rapidly approaching 200 programs in the GME system. Total accreditation actions between our January and April meeting. We've granted continued accreditation to roughly 183 diagnostic radiology programs, and very few, there's only 1 program on warning and 1 program on probation. This is the type of balance we like to see. We want to see the majority of programs in good standing on continued accreditation. So our AOA partners, everyone is familiar with the merging of accreditation activities between the AOA and ACGME. Currently, there were 14 AOA diagnostic radiology programs that were eligible to apply for accreditation. Right now, we can only account for 9 of them, but 7 of them are in fact accredited and have a status of initial accreditation, and 2 of them will be representing themselves to us hopefully very shortly. The others we haven't heard from. I don't know what that means, but I do know that the AOA leadership has done deliberate efforts to reach out to programs to assess their interest and whether they plan to apply for ACGME and help them understand the next steps. So in terms of our accreditation actions for the interventional radiology and ESIR, this year we granted accreditation to 4 integrated interventional radiology programs. Very different number than just a year ago. That means that the number of applications are slowing down. We have quite a few programs already in the queue, and that's very good in terms of the numbers that we need versus the number of fellowship programs that we're expecting will need to close. Independent programs, I think this was our first agenda where we saw a significant number of independent programs being reviewed and approved. There's 16 total, and of course we approved 27 diagnostic radiology programs to have ESIR designation. This is the total stats in terms of where we are right now. Total number of programs accredited for interventional radiology integrated is 65. Independent programs is 16, and a total of 72 diagnostic radiology programs currently have ESIR status. So let's talk about some of the observations we noted during this most recent review cycle. This is the annual year in terms of the data that you provide to the ACGME. You report your case log information at the top during the June-July timeframe, and then we move down here. Your ADS annual update will happen at the end of the summer. The end of the middle of winter, you'll do your milestones evaluation between November and December. The ACGME will administer the resident faculty surveys, the first of the calendar year between January and April, and of course your last milestones evaluation in May, June. Of this information, what the review committee is deliberately reviewing and evaluating are your ADS annual update and the results of both the resident and faculty surveys. These are the program attributes that are being evaluated by the review committee every year. So let's move into the most important thing. We've talked about this numerous times. We will continue to talk about it, and that is the case log reporting. We are still seeing extreme minimums and extreme maximums are still being reported by programs, okay? Guys, we just want to remind you that it is the responsibility of the program director to evaluate the resident case logs on an annual basis. That's not only to target that the resident is actually obtaining an adequate clinical experience, but to ensure that the numbers being reported are compliant with the RRC expected minimums for each procedural category. We have ramped up our follow-up in terms of programs that are not compliant with the minimums, in terms of actually issuing citations, and at times I think we've actually initiated a site visit or two for programs that were significant repeaters in terms of not meeting the minimum and reporting erroneous data for the case logs. I don't know if you can see those stats, but these are the annual numbers that are compiled by the ACGME Data Department by procedural category. As you can see, the highest number that any resident in the diagnostic radiology program reported was that they did 42,391 chest x-rays in their diagnostic radiology residency. I think last year the number was 25,000. We have a resident reported that they did over 11,000 CTs for abdominal pelvic. And of course, we're still seeing zeros being reported as the minimum for every category required. We just ask that you really pay attention to this information. It is being evaluated as part of your accreditation. I think we've sort of used a ramp-up process in terms of following up with programs in terms of the inception of the next accreditation system. When we first started the next accreditation system and this process of evaluating programs on an annual basis rather than on a cycle length, we started with just sort of giving you a gentle nudge and giving you some AFIs, bringing it to your attention, and we've slowly been ramping up that level of follow-up to see if we can get better information. And I can tell you that every time we've issued a citation or given some feedback, the feedback I always get in the office is, oh, it was an error, we can fix it, okay? So let me couch the bad news with good news, Psych 101. So while errors are still being reported, we are in fact seeing some improved information being reported in the data system. When we first started a couple of years ago, back in the academic year 2014-15, we had about 99 programs that were flagged for reporting information that did not meet the minimums for their graduating class. This most recent academic year, we've gotten that number down to 32. So it is in fact improving, and we appreciate the effort and reporting the accurate information. But we still have room to improve. So let me talk about some of the most common citation categories that were issued over the past academic year. I can tell you that the sample of programs that developed this information also included all of the new applications for AOA and a few new applications on the allopathic side. So there weren't, some of these weren't from continued accreditation programs or programs that were in a negative accreditation status. In terms of faculty responsibilities, subspecialty chiefs, it was noted that some programs actually hadn't identified a subspecialty chief for each subspecialty area, or that the subspecialty chief was not dedicating at least 50% time towards their subspecialty area. A lack of faculty participation in conferences for residents. And the final area is a lack of interest in education. And that area really sort of came out of the resident survey in terms of the faculty interest in resident education and supervision as reported by the residents in programs. The resident evaluation, there was either a lack of knowledge on behalf of the program that there needed to be a resident learning portfolio, or that a learning portfolio had not been started, or it was not an actual form or activity, but just sort of maybe a piece of paper that did not quite meet the expectation of the review committee. The summative evaluations, this was very common in some of the new applications, in that the summative evaluation document did not include that closing statement that said the resident is deemed competent to practice without supervision. Program evaluation, this was sort of combined with confidential evaluations, and that the programs did not have a mechanism to provide confidential evaluations of the program and or faculty. Of course, faculty scholarly activity, this was just a lack of productivity overall. And the educational program, that is a broad bucket, and it sort of ran the gamut of nuclear medicine experience, mammography experience, as well as areas that were highlighted by the resident survey. They fall under the category of educational program. Most common areas of improvement. Now, we know the difference between a citation and an area of improvement is that an area of improvement is really sort of a professional nudge from the committee saying, hey, this is an area you really want to pay attention to before it becomes a real problem. The most common area that we've issued areas of improvement for are, of course, case logs and providing accurate information for the graduates. The evaluations, educational content, faculty supervision, and resources, all of those categories were related to resident survey responses for the programs. Okay. Guys, accurate information is, in fact, essential. How many of you have been program directors for more than 10 years? So you remember when we first rolled out our online data system, and updating that system on an annual basis was just sort of this pro forma exercise where you updated the resident roster and you were done with us for the year. That's not the case anymore. All of the information housed in that system is your accreditation information that you're being evaluated on each and every year. So please take it seriously and evaluate the information that you're submitting. I can't tell you, I've had this response literally several times, not just from this community, but from other communities, that when they've received some feedback from the review committee that says you provided inaccurate data, whether it's on the block diagram, whether it's the faculty roster, the response we get in the office is, my coordinator did it. That's not an acceptable response. As the program director, you are in fact responsible for all of the data that is submitted to ACGME and evaluated for your program. Okay, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Anderson, who's going to talk to us about some of the recent discussions at the review committee.
All right, thanks, Felicia. I just make one more comment about the accurate information in the ADS system and updating it yearly. So if you put yourself in our shoes, I mean, we're trying to evaluate programs that we aren't at or we don't know. And the only insight we have into your program is really through what you put in the ADS system. And so having accurate information, and we can tell when things are, completely erroneous, if you have faculty that aren't certified or certified by the wrong specialty or things like that. I mean, it's fairly obvious. But that makes us question everything that's in that report then, because we don't know what's accurate and what's not accurate. So it is really important to check that over, make sure it's accurate. The other thing about the ADS system is if you think about the cycle that she showed earlier, the faculty survey from like the current faculty survey that you just got the results from, you have those results before we ever have them as far as a review committee. And so you have a chance to actually look at those, evaluate those, and act on those. And you can put in how you're addressing issues on that in the ADS. You can put it into program changes or some portion of the ADS system that shows us that you actually have looked at your survey and addressed some of those things before that ever comes to us to review. And so you can offset a lot of things that are potentially citable or that might flag us to review your program if you address those things before. So if you think about the cycle of how we evaluate, you actually have a chance to respond before we ever see that survey result. So keep that in mind. The ADS is really your way of communicating with us, and it can be updated continuously for the most part. There's a few little time periods where it's blocked out, but for the most part, you can update that at any point in time. So keeping your faculty up to date, keeping your residents up to date if they transfer mid-season or something like that, and putting in changes in your program if you're addressing things after your annual program evaluation. So those are all good things to use for your ADS system and to use it properly. Okay, so a few of the things that we've discussed at review committees. These are questions that come up, and this one still comes up periodically, despite the fact that we've stood up here for several years now, and we've slowly changed this over time. But we get the question, can a clinical year abroad count for a required preliminary year for entry into diagnostic radiology? And the answer is no. The ACGME changed that rule. We've kind of made some modifications to allow for some IMGs for 1 year. Because of the timing of everything, but that closed and we officially announced that. And so now the only group that's still kind of in a category is the AOA group as they become accredited and things like that. But otherwise, you need to have your residents do an ACGME clinical year to qualify to go into the residency. This is one of the other questions we've gotten, and it kind of is a more broad question, but this is the specific question as to whether or not the residents can fulfill their case log requirements by attending the ACR Dartmouth PET CT course. The case logs really are supposed to represent the experience that the residents get at your institution. So there are things like AIRP, which supplies some education for curriculum of anatomy pathology correlation, but that isn't really case logs. You can't really count those things. The idea is that case logs are supposed to be the experience your residents have with your faculty. And although someone could go to this course and learn some PET CT and things like that, you can't count those for case logs in order to bump up your numbers. You either have enough at your institution or you don't. And if you don't, you need to figure out a way to try and get some more. But if you feel like this supplements your education at your institution and you want to send residents to this, then that's allowable. This one has come up, and I think maybe here last year is when we kind of first really realized that most people seem to think that that all residents had to complete a QI project. And I think there's a little bit of a nomenclature or wording issue with the milestones versus the program requirements. But the requirement is actually that residents participate or are integrated in a QI project, but it never actually says they have to complete a project. The idea is to educate them about the quality improvement process, to have them learn about it, and to have them participate in some fashion with it. But to actually do a project from start to finish is not really the intent of that requirement. So that should ease some people's minds, perhaps. All right, on to program requirement revisions. There's quite a few slides here. I'm going to buzz through some of these fairly quickly because I've got another interactive session that I'm going to do where I'll go into a little more depth and we'll get some audience response type stuff. So if I skip through a few of these slides fairly quickly, they'll be posted so you can review them at your leisure. So we are going through the program requirement revision. I did see and have heard as I've been here, many people seem to think they're already in effect, the things that we talked about last year. They aren't actually even officially approved yet. So none of the program requirements that we've been talking about for the last year have actually been approved by the board yet. That's likely to happen either in June or September, and they will go into effect on July 1st of 2018. So all the things that we're talking about as far as new requirements actually go into effect in July 2018 for radiology. Now there are some common requirement revisions that have been done, and I'll talk about those a little bit later so we don't confuse the two. Remember that the program requirements are basically a set of documents to establish what a program needs to be able to adequately train a resident. And I'll go back to this, and I think Val Jackson said this in the ABR update, is, you know, there's different components of what happens, and it took me a while to kind of figure this out as well. But, you know, the ABR certifies individuals, and they, you know, test their knowledge, but they don't test the whole person. The ACGME accredits programs. We make sure the program has the resources to train residents, but we don't certify individual residents either. The program directors are responsible for taking care of certifying that they're well-trained, and then ABR tests them to make sure their medical knowledge is up to a certain standard, and the ACGME oversees the programs to make sure that you have the resources to do that. And so remember that as a program director, your responsibility is to certify that the resident is trained, and that's what you sign off on when you send them out your door. So when you make that final statement that they're competent, take that seriously. And probably most people sign off most anybody, but hopefully you're actually truly evaluating them and deciding whether or not they're competent to go out there. So basically what we try to do is set the minimum standards for the resident training. We don't set up curriculum. We set up expectations for what the residents should have kind of as a overall training capacity, and provide oversight, monitoring, and improvement for the programs. So we started the major revisions back in 2015. The last major revision was in 2008. We wanted to, every 10 years we go through a revision, a major revision. And the idea is to better reflect current educational environment. It constantly changes with the new accreditation system and all of that. All of that has come into effect since the last time these were revised. The IR program, since it was a new set of documents, but it's very closely tied to the DR program requirements, we needed to go through and do a focused revision of those in order to have the two sync up properly. And so that process is going on at the same time. As I said, both documents, the new changes will go into effect a year from now, assuming it all gets approved and things like that, which is still an unknown, but should happen. So here's where we're at. You can see it's a lengthy process. We review it internally. We post it for public comment. That all happened about a year ago. We review public comments. This one took a little bit longer because we also needed to post the IR changes so that they synced up. So that added a little more time. So that we had to go through this process twice, basically. Finish up some final deliberations, some final changes to the document, do a final draft. We're now submitted to the Committee on Requirements at the ACGME. They could potentially have minor changes, and we'll adjust those as needed. And then finally it gets submitted to the ACGME board for final improvement. And then hopefully a year from now they'll go into effect. So we kind of mentioned this last year, and I'll go through it again real quickly. The highlights of some of the changes that we did: number of core faculty, alignment with the ABR and core exam, that we've kind of defined 8 practice domains. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Because of that, you now need 8 core faculty to oversee those areas. So that's kind of the minimum number of faculty. There's these additional educational content areas that you need to teach, which you're probably doing anyway, but we give you more flexibility about how to designate faculty to do that education. And so I think we've made this maybe a little more complex, but more flexible. Program requirement revision, other highlight is that, remember that 66% of all the requirements, so everything you see in bold when you look at it online, is basically a common program requirement and not radiology specific, and thus we can't edit that. So those types of requirements are set in stone by the ACGME, and we don't touch that. Now, as I said, right now they're undergoing a revision as well, a pretty major revision. You may know that the Part 6 of those revisions have been released, and some of those go into effect this July. And so you need to be aware of those common requirement changes. Once all of that is finished, it may affect the layout of our requirements because some of the categories and some of the headings may change. And so we may have to make some editorial adjustments, but not content adjustments to the requirements. So the practice domains, just to remind everybody, we've kind of combined it to match more what the ABR is doing as far as testing. And also to kind of simplify how you designate faculty. So these are the 8 practice domains. Basically, we kind of combine gastrointestinal and urinary into abdominal imaging, and we combine cardiothoracic imaging into one category, so that at least small programs can have people that maybe commonly do those 2 things together and not separate individuals. You can actually just designate one person for each of those. The additional education content areas are the areas that the board is also testing on. And you're going to teach these when you're teaching the other content areas as well. So these are more the modality aspects of it. And so you can designate either separate individuals to kind of help educate your residents on that, or you can actually combine that with other people. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit more later. So the other big change is the program director and associate program director protected time. I'll spend a little bit more time when we get to the interactive talking about this. We made a sliding scale based on program size. We do recognize there's a lot more demands on program director time, and so we needed to give more support. We have scaled it back. We listened to comments from people during the public comments. We deliberated this at great length at the RRC. And we did scale it back with a slightly different scale now. So it expanded and it contracted in a way. So we'll show you that. But the smallest programs, we had it up to 0.4. We've scaled that back to 0.3 for the smaller programs. And remember that this is combined support for program directors and associate program directors. So if you have someone that's an associate, you can split this time. It doesn't have to all be for the program director. So if a large program needs 0.7 FTE support per the table that we supply, the PD can take some portion of it, like 0.4, and the associate program director can take 0.3. So it's more just saying that that's the amount of time we think that the people that are running the program should require in order to run it properly. So I'm just going to leave this up for a second because, again, I'm going to come back to this. This is our new scale. There's a couple adjustments that we made. We downplayed this amount of support, not because those smaller programs need less support, but we heard overwhelmingly from the small programs. We did a special survey of them to find out what they really felt like they needed. And although there was some support for even less than 0.3, the majority of support was for 0.3 or 0.4 support at those levels. We also adjusted the program size breakoffs at every 8 residents, which makes a lot more sense than every 10 because it kind of follows what most programs at least do is they take an even number per 4 years. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We also added the coordinator support. We put a sliding scale in for the program coordinators. We do recognize the importance of the coordinators, and this has been long needed, I think, and we finally get to put this in here. This scale is, I think, the same scale that we originally proposed. There was some discussion as to whether there should be less than 1 FTE for smaller programs, but there was actually a fairly large risk to losing support at those programs for any support at all if you took it down less than 1 FTE. So the smaller programs still, we say 1 FTE. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. Previously, the program director qualifications were pretty nebulous, to say the least, or non-existent. At some point in the long past, we had required 3 years of experience as a faculty member. That got dropped out on one of the revisions at some point, and so we put that back in. because we really feel like you need a certain amount of experience to be able to run a program no matter what your interest is. And that some training of some kind, either with a current PD, through the national organizations, coming to this meeting, those kind of things is kind of necessary for program directors to fully take on their job. And we're kind of done with the process of having somebody just designates whoever happens to not be standing in the room as the program director. It's really the most important job. I mean, it's the one that has to really oversee everything about the program. And they have to have good organizational skills. They have to be able to deal with the chairman, all those kind of things in order to do it properly. And if you take someone fresh out of residency, they don't always have that skill set. The board pass rates, the other big change, was a whole new experience from the previous requirements. Remember, this is based on the core exam, not the old oral, obviously, or the certifying exam. So we no longer use a first-time pass rate, which puts us a little bit out of the ordinary with most of the ACGME world, because almost all other specialties use a first-time pass rate. But because of the way our board structured the test, it was hard to justify having the certifying exam after your residents have left for a year and a half be your designation of how well your program did training them. So we're basing it on the core exam. Remember, we're looking at this year by year, and so we're kind of seeing how your program's doing on a year-by-year basis. But we know that if we just took 1 year worth of data, that wouldn't work very well. We'd previously used a 3-year rolling average, and that got a lot of comments about the smaller programs and what that would do to them. We listened to that, and so now we have changed that to the 5-year time period for the rollback. So still need a 90% pass rate by the time you finish residency for your residents, and we'll look back and average that out over 5 years in order to kind of smooth the curve out a little bit. So we do listen to you. Physics, there's a lot of comments both from physicists and program directors about the physics component. And I think the main thing here is, remember, we're not really a curriculum committee. Our job is not to designate what everyone teaches at every institution. That's up to the programs, and they need to figure out what works in their particular institution. And we want to provide certain guidelines and minimums, but on the other hand, we know there's a lot of variation in how it's taught and what's available at different programs. So we wanted to establish expected outcomes and support for the training of physics, because it's obviously an important part of radiology training. It's what sets us apart from a lot of the other specialties that do some imaging. So it is important. So our expectations are that there is some in-person educational content delivery. You can't just farm your residents out to a course or an online module or some other place in order to train your residents in physics. Ideally, you should have some personnel at your institution that can do some component of the training and for sure oversee the overall training. So you can use online modules, you can use other physics courses to supplement if you don't feel like your program has an internally strong physics training, but it can't be the sole content by just telling your residents to go study on their own. You need to have some kind of in-house curriculum with some in-person training. All right, so interventional radiology. We've talked about this for a long time. Again, I'll go through some of this fairly quickly because a lot of it's been touched on by others. We currently have an an IR advisory committee that's helping us go through the number of applications that are coming in. Felicia gave you the stats on the applications that we've gotten so far. That's a significant amount of work for our committee and for the advisory committee compared to what we usually see, where we might see one new application every year or two. To see 60, 70, 80 new programs come through in the course of 2 years is pretty significant. So it's pretty amazing what they've been able to do as far as an advisory committee, and also just a thanks to my committee for all that they've done helping us get through all this. So with all of that, you can you can look at the approved IR programs on the ACGME website. There's also a list of the ESIR programs that are approved. Things that we've found, I think some of this is the same stuff we saw last year, so a lot of this has not changed. Many DR programs are not officially decreasing their complement, but changing their match numbers to trade basically DR matched to IR spots. However, if you look at the actual stats from the match, the total number of trainees combined is up a little bit, so there were some IR programs that actually were expansions from their original DR program. And so we did actually go up slightly in the total number of match positions offered this year. As long as they have the resources, we've allowed programs to do that. For integrated, most of you in this room probably know this, so I won't talk too much about this, about just what the integrated program consists of. You can have in that PGY 5-year, the 4th year of DR training or IR training. You can have some call and float rotations. You can have some mammography. You can have some nuclear medicine. You can basically have other DR components in that as long as you still have the proper amount of IR training and it's still the majority of training in the integrated program. This is kind of the table that breaks it down. I've shown this many times. I pretty much got it memorized, but you may not, so I always put it back up again. But, you know, if you think about it, the intent of the original training was to have 2 years of IR experience. And so if you kind of take this world here as if it was a 2-year fellowship and then make it so that you had other entry points, that's where you come up with this training for integrated and this training for this ESIR and 1 year of independent training. And in any case, you still get about the same amount of total interventional type experience. And so I think the intent was to have, and the board had demanded that we have a similar type of training for any entry point, and I think we did that pretty well. There's still questions about what are IR-related rotations. I'm pretty much expecting that to last forever because it isn't really super well defined, and it can't really be super well defined because as many people as in this room are probably about as many different ways as it's practiced. And so there are places where IR is only done by IR fellowship trained people. There are places where there are body imagers that do a significant amount of IR. There are places that run by modality. There are places that run by organ system. There are small programs, there are large programs. So to really define exactly this is pretty difficult. But we give some guidelines, and here they are, and you can read through those to figure out what IR-related rotations are. There's a few special cases that we have kind of looked into a little bit closer. Dedicated rotations on vascular imaging can be acceptable because that's part of the domain of IR. Separate month of IR research in an IR integrated program is acceptable. Breast interventions, some places do that as a separate rotation. You can count that as an IR related, but then that can't count as one of your 12 weeks or 3 months of mammography rotations. You can't double count a month for both interventional and for your mammography requirement. ESIR, again, everyone should be pretty familiar with this now. Early specialization in interventional radiology, taking advantage of the R4 flexibility. It's not a separate program. I still get comments when I talk to people that people match for ESIR, or it's a separate program, or you have a complement. It's just a curriculum within diagnostic radiology. I did see, as I looked through the match data this year, that at least one program did separate out a tract for ESIR as a separate match. That's up to you and NRMP. I'm not sure that was our intent of this whole process, and I'm not sure whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but obviously people will try and figure out the way that works best for them. So if a program has a designated ESIR approved curriculum and their resident successfully goes through that process, then they can advance place into the final year of a 2-year independent program. Again, just to reiterate, you can't double count breast intervention, and you still need to hit all your MQSA requirements for mammography on that. So applying for ESIR, this is just a screenshot of the website. You can go into documents and resources. Here's your application guidelines. It's not an online application, it's documents that you submit to us. And so it's a little bit more work from that standpoint, but it's a relatively easy application as far as quantity. You still need to provide us with a block diagram. This is just an example. You need to designate which rotations are IR, which ones are IR related. You need to have your ICU or some kind of critical care month in there as well. Remember that rotations are defined as 4 weeks. It's amazing how many programs don't follow that rule. They have month-long rotations, they have 2-week rotations, 3-week rotations, 6-week rotations, 8-week rotations, pretty much every combination. So it's up to you to kind of convert it for us into weeks so that we can kind of evaluate it and not force us to have to count every week when you don't have kind of a standard rotation diagram. So remember that you need at least 44 weeks of IR related and 4 weeks of critical care of some kind. You've seen this, my favorite graph, just to explain how complements and training capacity work. Currently, your DR residents do a little bit of IR training, some amount each year, maybe a little more in their 4th year if they're interested in it. The rest of it is your DR component. Your total DR number is your complement. That's all of these people. And then your fellow is obviously the fellow complement. And your capacity really though, your fellows and your residents that are doing some component of IR is really your training capacity in IR. That's how many people you can train in your suite. And your DR capacity is kind of what's left over. Often people have a lot more DR capacity than they have residents. That's pretty common. And some places have a lot of IR capacity than more than they have residents, but that's not always the case. So in the new system, you kind of move these over into the integrated and independent programs, and you have an integrated complement, you have an independent complement, and you have a DR complement. Your capacity then starts to cross over into different parts of this, and your IR training capacity will take into account the people that are training in DR, that are doing more of it in the PGY 5-year, and then the people that are pretty much doing it full time in these other years. And then if you add your ESIR in, that person's going to be doing mostly IR, and so they're going to take up some of that IR capacity too. So internally, you need to be aware of what that capacity is and how many people you can train, and basically not take in more people. Part of our review of the programs is to try and figure that out. It helps a lot if you kind of do that for us again, because we don't know your program. So if you can kind of tell us what your end result is supposed to look at, how many people do you think you'll have training in ESIR in each of the integrated years and in any of the independent years? So currently in the integrated, there are 62 programs that have been approved. 55 of those come from current VIR fellowships. There are 6 that had no previous pre-existing IR fellowship. So we're getting a few new applications. We also know that there are a few IR fellowships that may not apply for the integrated program. We're still getting new applications in. There are 21 current IR integrated residents out in the system already. So even though last year there was a small match, and those residents will not have actually hit into the system yet. So those are all people that have transferred across or from a DR program into the integrated, or there's one program last year that accepted an R candidate in the match, so they started right away. So it's amazing that there are already 21 people in the system. 124 positions offered in the match this past year, PGY 1 and 2, and so that's a good number. And as you'd heard before, they pretty much filled. After SOAP, I think there were no spots that were offered that weren't filled. So I think that was pretty successful. Here's the numbers just going back for a few years from, again, NRMP data. You can see that this is the total number of PGY2, which just makes a nice comparable number. And you can see that we're actually up a little bit on total PGY positions if you count both the integrated and the DR programs combined. And so that's the slight expansion from integrated programs that added spots, and then a few AOA programs, and I think one new program that started. The independent program, we first started reviewing these applications this January. We put those off a little bit for two reasons. One, we wanted to get the integrateds up and running because they needed to be in the match and get people going as soon as we could. But also because the independent program really doesn't start till 2020, we knew we had a little bit of time to put those off so that we had time to review everything. But now it's getting to be crunch time again already. So we're putting a deadline to apply by June 1st this year. We know that if you haven't started, you may not hit that deadline, but just get the applications in as soon as you can. Because what we need to know is our total load of work basically for reviewing these, and spread those out over our September, January, and April meeting next year. And so the more we know up front, the easier we'll be able to distribute those. If we can get everybody reviewed in those next 3 meetings, then everybody will be up and running by the time the match for the independent program would happen in 2018-19. For ESIR, we've approved 55 curriculum, and there are 185 approximately DR programs in the country. We're getting more ESIR applications in rather rapidly now. Again, getting those in now is important. You need to have your curriculum approved. You know, it helps for recruitment for sure, and we hear that from programs. But by 2019, if you want to have someone in there as a third-year resident, or as a fourth-year resident, you'll need to have your curriculum in place by that time. So you want to get that application in as soon as you can. And so there's the deadline, June 1st, 2017. If you don't hit that, just get it in as quickly as you can after that, just so we can get it in the queue. If it needs a site visit, if it doesn't need a site visit, all of those things will be taken into account as far as when we schedule the review of the actual program. So everyone always asks, what's this mean for trainees? Here's kind of where we are and where we'll be. So if you're sitting here right now, we just had the main match. The fellow subspecialty match is going on right now. And this is kind of the timeline for what happens with each of those people. Next year, we'll have one more IR fellowship subspecialty match. And then that'll feed into the last fellowship year of 2019. And then in 2018, we need to have the independent match up and running so that we can start the independent residency in 2020. So we basically need, before kind of 2018-19 academic year, we need to have all the programs reviewed if we can. You can always come in later, that's not a problem, but if you want to be kind of in with everyone else, we want to get all these reviewed as quickly as possible. If you look at like your current residents that are in DR programs, and then medical students that are feeding in, this is it by year. And so these people are already matched and will start their fellowship this year. These are the people that are going through the match right now for the fellowship in IR. PGY3s obviously will do the fellowship match next year. PGY2s are the ones that are currently will be in the independent match to start fellowship in 2020. And then your interns basically will be into the independent match, as will anyone down the road. So everyone always says, won't everyone switch into IR integrated? There won't be any fellowship positions left over in the next couple of years. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing some people obviously want to switch over into integrated programs. There's some rationale for that. But since you can only transfer into your own program, that limits it somewhat, and you're somewhat in control of that activity. And so I often say, well, if one of my residents wants to transfer to Gene's program at UCSF, they can't do that. They have to transfer into our own program. And so that kind of limits the kind of chaos that would ensue if people just started jumping around everywhere. So transfers have to occur within your own institution. They should change it the academic year. People talk about transferring midstream. That's probably not a good idea. And remember, the final 2 years of training in the integrated have to occur in the same location. So transfers basically have to happen before the start of the diagnostic radiology 4-year or PGY 5-year. So the fellowships will all voluntarily withdraw on June 30th, 2020. There'll be no more IR fellowships at that point, and the independent residency and the integrated residency should be able to handle all of the IR training at that point. Again, we've made a lot of predictions the last 2-3 years, and they've pretty much been fairly accurate. We've thought about how many positions would be offered in the integrated programs. We said there'd probably be somewhere between 110 and 130, pretty close. We think there will still be probably about 150 to 180 positions in independent programs by the number of applications we're getting in. We seem to be pretty much on target for that. We think that most DR programs will have ESIR, not all. And by the numbers that are coming in now, well over half will have ESIR and probably much more than that. So I think our predictions have been pretty accurate. There's still a lot of unknowns, but things are going along fairly well as planned. A few of the key timeline dates. Basically, just stuff I just said. The common requirements, just one last little thing on that. If you haven't looked at Section 6 revisions, you should probably look at that. There's duty hour revisions. That doesn't often affect radiology, but there are some things that you need to look into about counting hours and how you schedule people. That there's some more flexibility in it, and there's also some areas that need to be monitored more closely, like home call and things like that. So be aware of those. We'll probably end up talking about that more at some point in the future. In our goals and objectives that were published, it said we'd talk about milestones 2.0. We're not really ready to talk about that yet. That's still being worked out. There will be a revision to the milestones at some point. We're not there yet, so I guess that's good news. But at some point, we'll be talking about milestones 2.0 and some adjustments to those. All right, so I'm going to do a little interactive thing here. It'll take me a second to get this up and running. All right, so I hope this works. So you can either log into your RSNA account if you've ever done Diagnosis Live, or you can actually just go to this website and play along. There's some opinion pieces in here as well as correct and incorrect answers. I don't really know how to do this from standing at the podium. I always move around when I do this, but I can't. Well, but then I can't move the slides. So I'll just I'll figure it out. So we'll do a sample question here. So again, you can either go to live.rsna.org, log in with your RSNA information, or you can go to this website. That's where you log in. And there's our first sample question. Remember, you have to hit submit. That's the thing everyone always forgets. Sometimes you have to scroll down on your phone in order to see it after you pick your answer. So which national park is in Oregon? Not many people are logged in yet. We're not going to spend a lot of time doing this, but hopefully people will get going. Because I do want to find out. I've got some. Sure. I think. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, they don't make it easy. Case sensitive, obviously. All right. 26, 27. All right, we'll keep going just to keep on time. All right, great. Crater Lake is the correct answer. All right, so just to get an idea who's in the room, just put down, there's no correct answer obviously for this, just put down what role you primarily play, just so I have an idea of what we're dealing with here. There's way more than 40 people in this room, and I bet way more than 40 people have smartphones. All right, if you're not counted, you don't exist. All right, so a lot of program directors, 59%, associate assistants, so good. All right, mostly program directors and associates, a few others. All right, this is just to make sure, one more last kind of sample question from our earlier, see if you were paying attention. What percentage of the program requirements are common requirement language? One right answer. More people are getting logged in. Some people are changing their answer. It always takes about 3 questions to get people up and running. All right. All right, most people got that right, 66%. All right. So remember, that's the new framework. So don't be surprised if in the course of the next year, even though we'll get our program requirements revised and approved, and they'll go into effect next July, they'll probably get rewritten to some extent as far as the organization of it, because common requirements 1 through 5 are getting a really major revision. They're basically being rewritten, and some of the categories will change a little bit. And so things will kind of go into different places on the document. And then the part 6, which has already been released, luckily in radiology, I think there's only like 2 lines of information that are specific to radiology in that part. And so that won't change too much. So you can read through those and just realize that you have to follow common requirements as well as the specific requirements. So remember, there's 3 layers of requirements, especially for new program directors in the room. There's institutional requirements, there's common program requirements, and then specialty specific. You're responsible for all of them, essentially. Your institution will largely take care of the institutional, but from a program standpoint, you're definitely responsible for the common program requirements and the specialty specific program. In the new common requirements section 6, there's a lot of things that are in the common requirement language that your institution will probably take care of. Like for student wellness and physician wellness, but you need to be aware of those things and make sure that you're on, especially if you're in a smaller place, that your institution is taking care of that, because your program will be judged on whether it's following all the program requirements as well. And remember, if you're a fellowship director, then you need to follow any subspecialty common and subspecialty specific requirements as well. All right. So again, just kind of whether you were paying attention earlier, the revised requirements, how many faculty do I have to have in charge of the practice domains, or whatever we want to call them? All right, I'm putting a time limit of 30 seconds on you guys, so you got to be quick. All right, great, 8. So, right, so before we used to need 9, I think. Currently, we still need 9 people in your program. This will go down to 8, so it makes it a little easier. And again, you can designate people in all sorts of ways. We tried to match kind of the 18 areas tested on the ABR exam. You need 1 core physician in each of the 8 domains. You can do more. If you're from a big program, you want to divide up cardiac and chest, you can put 2 people in for those 2. If you want to separate out genitourinary, if you want to separate out brain and head and neck, you can do that. You can do more, but you have to have at least 8. These are those categories. Remember, it aligns kind of with the sample grid that ABR used to always show. So just click through that. So those are the 8 categories there. And then you need to be able to have people that are designated as teaching the kind of other areas, the modality areas, as well as physics, quality and safety, and radiology or informatics. Remember, we've gotten a lot of comments about the radiology informatics. How do we have someone that can teach that? You just need someone that has some area. They don't have to be like an absolute expert in it. They just need to be able to be in charge of a curriculum that helps your residents learn some aspect of radiology informatics at whatever level that is. We're not being very specific about what the content of that is, but we do think it's an important part of radiology education, especially for the future. And so having somebody that can give some educational content and oversee some of the educational content for radiology informatics is important. So here's kind of my sample. If you have a small program, you're going to have maybe 8 faculty, and they're going to be in charge of multiple areas of education. There'll be one in charge of each of those practice domains, and then they may also teach CT and ultrasound. There may be somebody that does cardiothoracic and informatics. Your MSK person could help teach, oversee the curriculum for MRI and so on. So, and then you need to have somebody that's kind of in charge of your physics curriculum, whether it's a physicist, whether it's one of your physicians that just happens to know a lot about physics and wants to run the curriculum for that. In a large program, you can start splitting those out into as many people as you want to. So very big programs can have many different people in charge of different educational content areas, as well as the practice domains. Okay, so here's more an opinion question. How much protected time should a program coordinator or program director get? And we usually get a lot of different answers to this. So this isn't necessarily what we're actually requiring, but what do you think? All right, that's a pretty good response rate. All right, so again, most people actually do agree that it probably depends on the size of your program. Some people think, there's a fair number of people that thought 2 days per week. So now this is actually a question, what is the minimum amount of time that we're requiring? So in a small program, what's the least amount that you can have? All right. So that's right, 0.3. So right now, currently in the program requirements, it's 0.2. That's what it's been for a very long time. The smallest programs will now need 0.3 if you have 15 or less residents in your complement, and then it scales up from there. So why did we adjust it? We listened, there were a lot of public comments about the amount of time for the smaller programs, and they felt that having too much time was burdensome. Then we additionally, because we hadn't really heard from everyone, we sent out from ACGME a special survey just to the small programs to find out. And although we got some various answers, I mean, the vast majority of people thought that it should be scaled down from what we had before. And so we started at 0.3, 0.4 for programs that are 16 to 24, and then scaling up every 8 residents for that. So that gives us our current oh yeah, so when we did that survey, how many programs, what percentage of programs out there, of the 190-ish programs, what percentage of programs have fewer than 24? So they basically take 5 or less than 6 residents per year, so 23 or less. All right, it's a lot of wrong answers. So yeah, it's about 46% of the programs have less than 24 residents per year. So almost half the programs are, relatively small. If you actually get up to 24 and include the ones that take 6 per year, you're well over 50% of the program. So the vast majority of programs are actually 6 or less residents per year. And even if you look at total number of residents in training, if you count 24 and below, it's probably half-ish are trained in smaller programs of 6 or less. So despite the much larger size of the big programs. So this is a new scale. As I said, it's every basically 8 residents. It goes up 0.2. So always the big question when we show this is, that's just incredible. How can you do this to us? But is it really that crazy? Here's internal medicine and emergency medicine program requirements. Internal medicine, 0 to 23, they require 0.5. 24 to 40, between the PD and the APD, they require 0.7. 41 to 79, they get up to 0.9. EM, they also break it down, they get up to 1.7. They actually specifically say you have to have a couple APDs at that level. So ACGME realizes the burden that's on the program directors and want to support the program directors. We know that's sometimes a burden for different programs, but it's an important role. It's part of your objective. So we're not too out of whack with several of the other programs, whereas before we really were. I mean, 0.2 was pretty minimal compared to almost all the other specialties. So it was an important thing that we changed, and we tried to be cognizant of programs, but we did need to add some support for that. Remember that if you have 32 or more residents, you're supposed to have an APD or multiple APDs. When you have less than 32, you can still have an APD, that's fine. We just don't require it. And remember that protected time is based on DR complement, and that's one of the things that I can't really emphasize enough. It's the only way we have at the ACGME to know how many residents you have, because you may not match someone, you may take an extra person one year, you may have different numbers in each of your years of training, and so that kind of stuff changes every year, but your complement is relatively fixed unless you ask for a change. And so if we're going to evaluate how much protected time you're supposed to have, we have to kind of go off a fixed number. So even though you may take less residents than you have, the amount of protected time you're supposed to get per the scale is based on your complement. Now, where that gets a little bit complicated is the programs that have IR and DR. And so for that, the idea, and we're going to send this out in a FAQ, I can't really explain it all verbally, but they're basically additive. The IR programs, I think, is my next question. Yeah, so for IR, what's the amount of time that we're requiring? So we didn't end up changing that, so you have to remember that from last year. So most of the IR programs are 20 residents or less. There aren't any programs right now that have, for an integrated program, have requested more than 20 total, which is 4 per year. So they're relatively small. And so 0.2 is the correct answer. So we're the IR, so basically if we have a complement of 24 DR residents and 5, 1 per year, integrated residents, you would need 0.5 for the 24 residents and 0.2 for the integrated program director. That's true even if you traded out one of your spots like we did. We traded one of our match spots to IR. So technically in diagnostic, we'll only have 5 per year going into the future. So we'll fall under that 25. And IR would have their 5 eventually. But we're still counting on the total complement size. And I can answer questions about that if you have questions. So why didn't we do a sliding scale for IR like DR? Because they're small. There are some shared resources. Most programs did alter their match numbers to kind of share things. We did feel that like even for small programs, you need some amount of time to do the IR program director job, even if you do share that to some extent with the DR person. These are some of the other comments or questions we get a lot. If my department gives 0.2 of protected time, does that count toward my PD, APD? We're not here to micromanage how you do it at your institution. That's up to you and your chair. So some programs will count that as part of your protected time, some programs won't. You'll have to kind of figure that out for yourselves. We just want the program director to have enough time to do their job. If you need extra time to do research, academic stuff, or be equivalent to the rest of your faculty, then you'll kind of have to do that yourself. People will ask, well, does it have to be, do I have to have 1 day off a week? You can allocate the time however you want. It's a year, it's an FTE. If you want to count the time you spend here as part of your program director time and then not take any off the next couple weeks, you can do that. So again, we're not here to micromanage how you run your protected time. We just want to make sure you have enough to do your job. And then people have asked, well, if I'm a bigger program and I have 0.9 or 1.0 of FTE that's supposed to be protected, I won't be doing any clinical work. But again, you can divide that up with your associate program directors. So ideally, you should be doing some clinical work and working with your residents and seeing what they're doing. So we don't expect that one person is going to have all of that. And it's kind of mandated that once you get up to a certain point, you need to have an associate program director to share that time off. Okay, case logs. How many chest x-rays can a radiologist read per day? I know my record back when I did general radiology, but I know I didn't want to do that 2 days in a row. All right, no wrong answers. All right, let's see what people say. Pretty wide. So a lot of E's and F's. That's good. All right, 150, 200 chest x-rays a day. Busy practice. That's probably reasonable. Should your residents be able to do that? Maybe by the time they're done. Probably not. So if you look at that number, 42,391, which is over 4 years, I don't know, my residents usually do 16 weeks on chest, maybe a little bit more than that. That's 2,650 studies a week or 530 studies a day. I don't think anybody's doing that. So there's a lot of variation. People can report lots of data. This is 4 years worth of data. So maybe this person did a mini fellowship and they spent 46 weeks doing chest. Then they could potentially 184 every day, 5 days a week. I'm not sure they'd be getting a lot of other education, but they could potentially do that per what everyone said. If you read every day, you'd have to read 46 chest x-rays every work day to get that number. So I don't know if that's erroneous numbers or not. But that program actually, everyone reads somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40,000 chest x-rays. So they've either got wrong data or they're putting in erroneous information. And the same way with zeros. I mean, how do you have residents that go through 4 years of training with 0? So we know that that's just wrong. Being accurate about the case logs. And people say, well, why are we doing this? I mean, it doesn't mean anything. But what's one of the common questions I get asked and people get asked? It's how many studies should my resident be reading? What's kind of the average norm? Well, we have data now. If we actually have accurate number, and we probably have enough data now just washing out some of that erroneous information that, the national average for a resident over 4 years is probably somewhere around 4,600. That's probably not an inaccurate number for what's happening out there. If we really get truly accurate information from everyone, this could be fed back to you to be helpful. And so you would know, and then we could adjust what national resident standards should be that would more accurately reflect what's going on out there. So it's probably a good representation of average experience. If you think about the MAMO numbers, if you do 12 weeks, 5-day weeks, that's 13 to 14 a day. That's not too burdensome, I don't think. As an average, that probably underrepresents what's actually going on out there. The average chest number is about 93 per day if you do 12 weeks of chest, or 57 per day if you do 16 weeks. The lower extremity MR, if you do 12 weeks of kind of musculoskeletal type rotation, that's only 2.5 a day. Is that really what our residents are seeing on average out there, or is that underrepresenting? I don't know. But if we actually had accurate data, if people really reported this accurately, it would be helpful to know this, because then you could say, I expect my resident to read 5 knee MRs a day while they're on the MSK rotation or whatever. So I think it's actually important data. We've kind of, so far just been rolling it out. And people say it's not all that important, but I think it could be important and it could be helpful. And it's not so much about accrediting your program, it's about giving you feedback about your program. And that's kind of the spirit of the new accreditation system, is we're trying to help you improve. And if we can gather data from all the programs, feed that back to you and give you information that then you can improve your program, I think we'd be doing a lot better job than just accrediting you and giving out citations. One last thing about case logs. Case log minimums are not meant to be a measure of competency. They're a number for us to accredit programs. It's to see if you have the resources that we think, and we know it's probably not super accurate yet, but we're hoping it'll get there. It was developed by ACGME to assess program resources, and ideally we should be able to develop a national database of these procedures, and we can feed that back to programs to see if they're kind of giving the experience that other programs are giving. All right, is there any reason for a 0? And I'm not going to leave this up because we're running short on time, but the answer, of course, is E. Okay, procedures. This is one I want to get, like, what people think. What's a procedure? We hear it all the time. Oh, my residents do this procedure, that procedure. What is a procedure? And this gets to be really important with the IR programs. If you're going to have a resident that's going to go through ESIR, they're going to need to know what the procedures are that they do at your institution when they go to another institution to an independent program. And if everyone's talking different language, it's not going to work out very well. All right, let's see what we got. So look at that. 3 different, basically C, D, and A. So any image-guided intervention, anytime a needle's stuck through the skin, any action done directly, with even people saying anytime substance. So if everyone's talking about different things for procedures, how do we know what residents are actually doing? How do you count your procedures? Do you have your resident log them in kind of personally as they do them? Do you go back and search for them by CPT code? Do you hunt for them by dictation through your dictation system? Some combination? Or you don't keep track? So again, pretty wide diversity of what people do. And so again, we're going to run into all sorts of problems. Case logs are CPT based. That's pretty straightforward. But when you keep a procedure log of your residents, of their actual procedure experience, we get in all sorts of different things. We'll get people that only run CPT codes. We'll get people that count every vessel that they cannulate for an angio as a different procedure. We'll get people that count lumbar punctures and people that don't count lumbar punctures. People that count GI procedures. So there's too many different ways, and so we're going to try and bring that all together. So for the integrated residency, there's going to be a case log system. They'll need to have that as well. We hope to have that actually released soon, within the next few weeks. They'll include, so for integrated residencies, they'll have to keep track of the DR case logs just like we do now, and you'll have to keep track of IR case logs. And remember that case logs are different than the global procedure log, or what we're now kind of calling patient encounters. So case logs are CPT based, But your global procedure log, we want people to start counting them as patient encounter logs, basically not counting them as CPT, although you could still search CPT code and potentially get that information. So there's lots of different ways, but it should be one patient, kind of one procedure as a general rule. We're going to have some guidelines that are actually being developed while we're at the meeting here this week that we're going to get out to people so that they'll have some guidelines on how we basically want all programs, DR and IR, to start categorizing procedures so that when we start moving residents between different programs, we can all talk the same talk. And remember, none of this is anything that you haven't been doing before. Your residents should be keeping procedure logs anyway. So if they're doing that, you may adjust how you do it or in what manner they're doing it, but ideally every DR program, one of the requirements is that you keep a procedure log for your residents. So patient encounter logs is what you'll kind of hear us term them as now, just so there's less confusion between the case logs and procedure logs, and we'll get some specific guidelines out. So I think we all know this one. So we changed this to 5 years. We expect 90%. And I already talked about that, and we'll move on to questions. All right.
Murray Janower from Boca in Boston, Worcester St. Vincent Hospital and MGH. You finally mentioned small programs. Thank you.
Sure. I'm from one, by the way.
Well, I don't, just wait till you hear me. The fact is that indeed 45% of our programs are small programs with about a third of the residents. When one looks at the Residency Review Committee, there, I think, is zero representation from private practices. Now, I know, or from small practices defined as 20 or less by the APDR. Now, I know that the RRC does not pick the members. They come from the 4 organizations. I would suggest that the RRC send out a strong letter to each of the 4 organizations, strongly suggesting that with their next appointment, they pick someone from a small practice. 1, 2, and it's terrible. It's all university. The other thing that's very obvious is that there's a gross geographic distribution and that the middle of the country is completely excluded from having any representation on the RRC. I make these comments as an ex-program director for over 30 years and as a member of the RRC in the last few decades.
Yeah. No,
I made these suggestions about 30 years ago, and there was no action taken. So I hope that now there will be. I think it's terrible. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for your comments.
Joanna Fair from the University of New Mexico. I just have a question about ESIR. So we are now designated as having ESIR for 1 resident per class, and we've been approved for the independent IR residency for 2 residents. We vary in our 6 residents per DR class between having 0 and 3 residents who are interested in IR over the past several years.
Yeah.
So is there any flexibility when we have 2 who are interested in terms of the ESIR designation?
Yep. So I think this is something that's largely misunderstood. So for ESIR, there's no complement to the ESIR. It's up to your. We have recommendations as to how many you think you can train.
We were denied for 2. We applied for 2, and we were told that
Right.
was an overreach, and so then we applied for 1.
Yeah. So we'll look at like what your resources are and decide whether or not you can handle that amount of training. And so we may put like an upper limit on it. But say you plan on training one person in the independent program and having one ESIR person. So ideally you have at least the amount of training capacity for 2 people. And maybe you have training capacity for 3. If you truly have 3 people that you have training capacity for, you could still have 1 in the independent and 2 in your ESIR, or you could have, if you're approved for 2 in the independent, you could have 2 in that and 1 in the ESIR. So you're allowed to kind of adjust that, especially for the next several years for sure. And I think it's up to each program to determine we can sort of judge as what we think, but you're going to be the one there and be able to judge whether your residents are able to get the amount of training they need to qualify.
We have a ton of capacity. We have faculty who are doing cases on their own, so we can welcome more.
All right.
Chuck Resnick, I'm the Diagnostic Radiology Residency Program Director at the University of Maryland. I have a question about program coordinators. There is a specific designation of how many FTEs that you need depending on the size of your program. So a program with 40 residents has to have 2.0 FTEs of program coordinator. Can you tell us if there are any rules regarding whether those program coordinators are allowed to do anything else? Are they allowed to administer fellowship programs, or can there be crossover between DR and IR, or can they do student programs, or are they required to devote all their time to diagnostic radiology?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's a tough one to answer. I mean, the short answer is basically we don't designate any of that aspect of it. We want to have you to have enough program coordinators to run your program appropriately. If you have a very experienced program coordinator that can handle doing some other things, especially as an associate coordinator or someone that's helping your primary coordinator, there probably won't be a problem with having that person do some other aspects of your department. There should be at least one of those people that's probably dedicated solely to your program, I would think, but your second person may actually be able to do some fellowships in addition to the coordinator position. But we're trying not to get too much into the weeds on that because, again, every program is so different. There's programs that if we say they can do other things, then they'll be taken advantage of. And if there's other programs that have very experienced people who are fully capable of taking care of more things than just the core program. So again, as the RRC, we're trying not to over specify the exact duties of the coordinators and giving you some flexibility on that. Does that sort of answer your question?
Hi, Divya Sridhar, NYU. I have 2 somewhat related questions about protected time for program directors.
Yep.
The first is when the protected time for integrated program directors begins, whether it begins when you physically have residents in the program or whether it starts in advance of that with recruitment, selection, et cetera. And the second is whether that's discrete from fellowship director time and whether fellowship directors should have a more granular assessment of their protected time as well.
Yeah, great question. So, as always, these questions are a little bit hard to answer straightforward, but so to answer your second portion, during the transition, we realized that when you don't have any residents in there, but you have a designated residency director, that their duties are pretty minimal. There's still some duties that go on even when you don't have residents, as far as updating ADS and some of those kind of things. And then the time you need to actually put in applications and things like that. If your fellowship director is your same person as your new residency director, and that person can do that in the amount of time that's set aside for the residency, we're not going to, again, micromanage that. So I guess the short answer to your question is no, you don't have to necessarily have protected time before you have residents in its full capacity. You should have time to do some of the things that you need to do. but it's not necessary that you'd necessarily have that before you get residents. That said, the next obvious question then is, does it scale up as you add residents into your thing? Do you start off, if you only have one resident, you get less than 0.2 and so on? I think once you get residents in, you should probably establish that you have a certain amount of protected time, just from a practical standpoint. So did that answer both your questions?
The second question was really about ACGME accredited fellowships
Oh.
and whether there is a move towards making that time allocation any more granular than it is now.
So we're redoing the neuro fellowships right now, and we're deciding whether we're going to like set a certain amount of time for the fellowship program director time, and we're not sure of that yet. We're still debating that. And for other fellowships, I think it'll probably be left a little looser than for the core program.
Hi, Bernard Chow, Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital Program Director. Had a question about ESIR and how an ESIR resident goes into an independent residency in year 2. I don't know if that's ever been clarified. Does the resident have to apply and get matched through a fellowship?
Yep.
What is the mechanism?
Yeah, so there will be a match. So NRMP has the radiology subspecialty match, which is what the fellowships use now. That will still be the method that's used to put residents into the independent residency. So in 2018-19, that academic year, there will be no longer a fellowship match for IR. There will be an independent residency match during that same timeline as the old fellowship match. And that will put people into position to start July 2020. If someone comes from a program that has ESIR and they won't have finished it yet by the time they match, because it'll be at the start of that last year when they match, when they get done, the diagnostic radiology program director will attest that they've completed the ESIR program appropriately. They will document their procedures, how many procedures they have, their case logs, and when the resident leaves the DR program to go to the IR independent program that they match to, they'll take all of that kind of with them, or it's transferred over to that program. And then that program will then kind of determine whether or not they do 1 or 2 years, with the expectation that everyone's agreed to that if they've completed the ESIR thing, they'll only do 1 of the 2 years. If somebody would fail completely doing an ESIR, they've already matched, but they got sick or something else where they could finish residency, but they couldn't get the experience they needed. Maybe they broke their leg their 4th year. They couldn't do any procedures that whole year. They were kind of in the ESIR, but they couldn't really finish it. Then that person may go to a program and they may not qualify for doing 1 year because they didn't really successfully complete the ESIR program, even though they were at a place that had it. That would be up to the independent program to determine. We think, obviously that should be a rare circumstance.
As a follow-up to that, so they could only apply to independent IR
Correct.
programs and not combined, not the integrated.
Correct. So the integrated only matches to PGY2, essentially. I mean, it's straight out of it's a medical school match in the main match. The independent is a subspecialty match, just like the fellowship match. Yep.
Hi, Michael Snyder, Program Director at Christiana Hospital in Delaware. We share a physics instructor with 4 other residency programs within about a 50-mile radius. Most of the lectures are done via live WebEx, both at our broadcast to all 5 institutions. How much of a percentage does the physics need to be in person, and how much can be done via WebEx, that kind of thing?
Right. So, I mean, I think certainly that, at least partially quality. I mean, if you've got a good quality physics curriculum that's being taught by a physicist, if it's done, because you can't physically get to those places, we understand that. I mean, ideally, every program should be doing some physics training as well through their radiologists, kind of the more practical aspects of physics. So I don't think we're setting a percentage. Again, we're trying not to micromanage every program. there should be some component of physics education that occurs at your institution in person so that it's not all a remote learning experience. But we're not going to, again, micromanage you down to a percentage. But you should figure out when you develop your physics curriculum how the in-person content is taught, because again, there should be some of that happening.
Certainly. So my concern was the bulk of the lectures, the so-called classroom time,
Right.
obviously hot lab and other things is all done in-house.
Right.
But that is valid, I guess. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lois Schumann from the Indiana University Residency Program. I'm the DR coordinator. And we have IR started. We've been approved and we have an IR coordinator. And the question has come up for the integrated two-year, two-year program. The first few years when they're in DR, who does the milestones, the 6-month reviews, the monthly evaluations? Is it the DR program or the IR program?
Yep. So the responsibility for the independent residents, or sorry, for the integrated residents, falls on the integrated program director and coordinator. So they're responsible. Now, if they agree, and at your institution you agree that it's easier and more capable and more efficient for you to share some of those responsibilities, but the program director and potentially the coordinator should kind of check to make sure those residents are being appropriately put in and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of where the responsibility lies, and then who does the physical work. How you want to designate that at your institution can be done, in multiple different ways, but it's still the integrated program director and the integrated coordinator's responsibility.
Okay, we're friendly. We're not at
Yeah,
war with
well,
each other.
that's not true everywhere.
Thanks so much, Doug Sillen from Yale New Haven Hospital. I'm really grateful to the ACGME for all the help and guidance they give me in training the residents and fellows, and also in garnering support from the hospital and the administration. But once a year, I do sort of take your name in vain, and that's when it comes to entering the CVs for my faculty. My neurointerventionalist is core faculty for 5 of our programs, and although her role is different in each of the programs, her CV is certainly the same. And I really struggle with web ads, particularly, we have a lot of faculty who ask me to be core faculty, but I just say, no, I try and keep it at the bare minimum. I don't want you, your CV is too long. It's time that I'll be, doing that instead of doing something better.
Yeah.
Is there any move to sort of updating web ads?
Felicia? There's a mic. I think the short answer is no.
We hear you. We heard this comment multiple times, especially in the ramp up of the IR application, when a lot of the DR faculty were now listed as core faculty in the IR application. And I personally have followed up with our data team on that. The answer is no. One of the reasons for that is, for example, if your program entered some CV information incorrectly, their certification or whatever, and that incorrect information goes to the next program and it's not specifically being evaluated, then you could have potentially put another program in jeopardy for getting a citation. And it's not being entered de novo by that program so that they own the data. So I'm sorry, but I tried.
Yeah. It's definitely a comment we've heard lots, and we're very aware of it, but we haven't been able to make any headway on that.
I'm Polly Canzaria, St. Vincent's Hospital in Worcester. So my question is that if a DR program does not have ESIR, the residents can never apply for the independent IR fellowship?
No, that's not correct. So the way it's designated, because we know there might be a resident that in their 4th year, even if they're at an ESIR program, decides they want to do IR late, or say some practicing physician wants to go back to training and get interventional kind of experience. So that's why it's a 2-year, the independent program is a 2-year program. And so anyone can apply to a 2-year IR independent residency from any program, or if they've been out in practice and want to come in and learn that. So even a program that doesn't have ESIR, what they are delegated to do is that they will need to do 2 years instead of 1 year. But if they're very interested in IR and they want to do kind of the full IR component and get all of the training, then they can do the 2 years.
And how many independent programs are there going to be?
How many independent
fellows.
programs? So that's what we're getting applications in for right now. Again, we're still making some guesses. Kate, do you know the current applicant pool? 20 in addition to the 16 we've already approved? Or that's total? Yeah, so we've gotten somewhere around 30-ish, maybe 35 so far. But I mean, just from talking to people and what we know there's going to be a lot more programs that come online. Again, we expect that the total number of IR training positions in the country between the integrated, which is about 125, and the independent should still be somewhere around 290, 300 total positions. So if all the IR programs do what they say they're going to do, there should be somewhere around 180, 170 positions offered in the independent match when that comes online. I mean, it could be a little less, it could be a little more, but I think that's a pretty accurate guess.
It's just something that we need to tell residents who are applying to our
Yeah,
program.
and we'll know a lot more in the next 6 months.
Matt DeVries from Nebraska, just a quick clarification point. So for our current first-year radiology resident or a PGY2,
Yep.
their only way into an IR will either be if we've gotten ESI, we have our ESIR,
Okay.
but will be to either have an integrated or an independent pathway in. And the only reason I ask is we've had a couple of residents, and I've heard through people that said, well, when we interviewed, 2 years ago, none of this was figured out.
Right.
I mean, we were kind of at these meetings and no one kind of sort of like, well, yeah, we'll be getting ES. And so we've got some first-year residents that feel like, they kind of got a bad shake out of this all.
Yeah. No,
So was there any consideration of extending the fellowships another year or so in order to account for those people that really didn't have informed consent, as it were, when they interviewed?
Yeah, the answer is yes. We did consider all of that as best we could. There was certain outside pressures to terminate things when it was terminated, and we tried to push back. We tried to accommodate and various other things, and that's just kind of the way it ended up. We're very aware of those people in the PGY2 year right now. I think their options are, if you have an integrated program, they can obviously potentially transfer across. If you don't, they can do the ESIR and then go to someplace that has an independent program and still do it in 1 year. And again, if worse comes to worse, the worst thing that we're doing to those people, and it's bad enough, I totally agree. I'm not making light of it, but they will have to do 2 years. So, yeah, I mean, we did consider all those things, and there's just a certain number of limitations we had outside of that. And yeah, I've got residents the same situation, so totally understand. One more question, then you can come up and talk to me.
Hi, Neil Madan from Tufts Medical Center. Twofold question. With the latest revisions to the program requirements for radiology, after the public comment period, is there going to be responses posted to the comments that were made, or is it going to be completely non-transparent?
You just heard it. No, so we don't have any it would just go into kind of a constant circle feedback if we put out responses and then had new public comments. So the process at ACGME is public comments, they come to us, we have to address those to the satisfaction of the internal ACGME world. Ideally, I'm up here trying to explain why we made decisions that we made as far as any changes to kind of address the comments that were made. But there's no official response to the individual comments out. That's pretty much the process.
Yeah, Jim explained it exactly. The purpose of providing the public comments is to show the board of directors that we have taken into consideration the opinions of the community that will be affected by those requirements. It's really a receivership and not necessarily a dialogue back and forth.
Okay, and then just as follow-up, was there any consideration or discussion about removing the internship year? I know that has been an idea that's been discussed at many previous times, but I'm just curious to see the extent to which it was discussed as the program was revised this time, and then considerations about changing the number of years of the radiology residency, say from 4 to 5, and maybe incorporating some of the internship year months into the residency program.
Yeah, so absolutely. That wasn't in the public after the public. This was at the beginning when we were going through the first draft of the major revision. There were extensive and heated discussions about that very aspect of how the first year plays into all this. And we know there's lots of opinions out there. And, you know, I could go on, but that's probably not the place to do it, about which way it should be or whatever. But yeah, there were extensive discussions, and for various reasons, we kind of settled on what we proposed. I'm sure those discussions will continue to go onward over the next few years, and potentially in the next revision, some of those things could change. Yeah. All right. I'll be up here if anybody wants to talk to me more.